Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network coming to you for yet another Sunday session. Today we have two special guests coming to us talking about a topic that many of us have heard one half of this an acronym, but not the other half. So Nimby, not in my backyard. For many of you, you've probably seen when you're trying to do developments that the neighbourhood and the community start to complain because they don't want to see upgrades and things like that happen in their area, but there is an alternative to that called Yimby. And so we've got Mel and Natalie who's going to be telling us all about what Yimby is. And so please welcome Melissa and Natalie. So hey folks, how are you?
Hello, thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So let's start firstly with, I guess, this concept of Yimby. So for many of us out there that are relatively new in the development scene, they probably haven't heard much about Yimby. So firstly, where did Yimby come from a concept? And I guess it's because it's not just a new thing in Australia, it's actually a global phenomenon.
I'll jump in. It's absolutely, it's really became a movement over in the US, in San Francisco, when housing prices, I guess 10 years ago now, were going through the roof and it was becoming extremely unaffordable to live in the city. A lot of people were commuting into the city from Oakland and other places just to work, and then commuting out because there just wasn't opportunities to rent or buy homes in San Francisco. So the movement really began when one lady, Sonia Traus, over in San Francisco said, hang on, why am I commuting out and I'm on the train going past City Hall and I can see all these people protesting against new housing developments? I should go in there and say, hang on, we need new houses, more houses in our city. So she turned up the next day by herself with her own picket, saying she was protesting the protesters. And from that, it's turned into a movement. And all of a sudden, there's images of a lot of people behind her. At first it was 2, then 5, then 10, and now hundreds and hundreds of people around the US saying we need more housing in our cities. So yes, in my backyard.
And so that's now grown into a global movement. So there's the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Sweden, Scandinavia, all sorts of places like that have got this movement. And I guess yourselves that are representing Queensland and New South Wales in this instance. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, the Australian history of this and when it actually started.
So again, I guess I'll jump in first and then I'll hand over to Mel. But I got interested in just hearing about this movement over in the US in about 2016, and all of a sudden there was going to be the world's first Yimby conference, and they even called it an unconference. It was not structured. It was about whoever wanted to turn up and tell their story. And so a friend of mine and I got on a plane and we went over to Boulder, actually, who hosted it in Colorado in the US. And it was really one of those moments where people say that's really when the movement was born. So certainly Sonia Traus spoke, but by that point in the US, there was a few different cities talking about the same topics. And this was just an amazing collective of people with great ideas, great messaging, great stories, all fighting for one cause, but coming from absolutely different backgrounds. And we just went, hang on, we've got to bring this movement to Australia. So we set up Yimby Queensland, and I guess, tried to make sure we spread that around Australia. So it's fantastic to have Mel heading up Yimby New South Wales.
Yeah, Mel. So I guess this is a volunteer type arrangement, and both of you have day jobs. So tell us a little bit about what you do in the day job for each of you and how your work is actually supporting you in actually bringing this movement forward.
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. So my day job is I'm a town planning consultant, and my job is to help developers get approvals, essentially. And so I've really seen the impact that a community can have on the approval process with council. And I think there can be some community pushback that arises, and then that really can impact council saying yes or no. And so seeing that firsthand, that a bit of frustration builds, because obviously I believe in what I'm putting forward, and believe that development is going to be good for the community and help things like a housing affordability. And I also feel that the community pushback can often be quite fear-based rather than actually reality-based. And so what I was attracted to, the reason I was attracted to Yimby is I saw it as a way to balance the conversation, as a way to help to show the benefits of good development. And that's what really got me involved. And then I guess it's sort of twofold. That's the more professional reason, but there's also a personal reason, which is I'm really committed to social and environmental issues and resolving some of the issues that arise in those two spheres. And I think we need more housing. We desperately do. It's a huge social issue, and we need to protect our environment. And these two issues are really at the heart of Yimby. And so I was like, when I found out about it and saw what Natalie was doing, I put up my hand to fly the Yimby flag, because it kind of ticks all those boxes.
And I guess I come from a similar background. I'm a town planning consultant by day as well. It doesn't mean all of our network are town planners. We've got people in community engagement, in architecture and landscape architecture, economics, and circular economy, engineering. So it's not purely planning, but certainly planners get passionate about it if we're the ones lodging development applications and then, feeling sometimes like we're hitting a brick wall because the community has gone ballistic about a new project that was going to actually bring something great to their suburbs. So I've read so many submissions against the projects that I think are great projects that I'm lodging in council and supporting. And at some point you just think, well, actually there needs to be better information out there in the community and someone actually balancing that conversation and pointing out what are those things that are actually great for our cities. And I guess also, as Mel says, it's a bit of a personal story. I can look at my own housing journey and, now 20 years or so later in my career, I live in a nice house in the suburbs, but that wasn't where I began my housing journey. And I think that, all too often there's conversations in the suburbs that say, well, all we really want to have is other houses just like ours. But people forget that when they might have first moved out of home, they lived in an apartment. They might want to downsize to an apartment or a townhouse as they get older. Everyone comes from so many different parts of the housing, continuum for different reasons. And yet we're just, producing so many houses and unfortunately banning or stopping or making it very difficult to put the other types of housing on the table. So I started in, my first property was an apartment. It was 3 stories in the suburbs. Unfortunately, in Brisbane, that's very hard now. It's all about 2 stories being the same height as a house. Or I then moved into a very small townhouse on a small block of land, but those lot sizes and, townhouse densities are getting challenged. And, it's just seems like there's more and more policy making it more difficult because the community is very loud about what they like and don't like without understanding why we need different housing choices, understanding them from different perspectives, different cultural backgrounds, different economic capabilities, and different stages in the life cycle. So it's all about trying to have that conversation with the community to help them to see development in a different light, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of people actually forget is that as property developers, we are the makers of community. We are the people who create the environments and the built form that people actually live in. And if we go all the way back 220 odd years ago, Australia was a 1-lot land subdivision, and every school that we live in, every house that we live in, every school that we send our kids to, every road, every shopping centre, it's property developers who have actually made that community, looking at, I guess, what the community needs are and putting the opportunity in front of them at the right time. I think where the community gets disenfranchised is they see development happening in their area and they forget that they right now might not want that particular outcome, but in 10, 15, 20 years time, as they start to age, as their needs start to change, as younger generations start to come through, that the community itself is actually evolving, and it's our job as developers to actually put that opportunity and the right solution in front of them at the right time.
And I've also seen, situations where there's a big community uproar against a project, and then once the project's delivered, it's actually sometimes people that were in those protests that end up moving into the development. And so it's about trying to bring that information sharing up front so that people can look at development without that fear of change at the forefront.
Yeah, so I guess we touched on this when we were having our pre-chat, but it's about informing our community, inspiring our community to actually say, look, this is what is actually needed and why it's needed, and using that information to actually influence their outcomes to say, look, this is actually for the betterment of the community itself. Whilst it might not be for you individually right at this very moment, the community itself needs it. And it's about taking them on that journey.
Absolutely. And it's also, as you said, taking them on the journey to realize by saying no, what are they inadvertently saying yes to? And so it's, things like yes to urban sprawl, yes to high commuting rates, yes to housing, unaffordable housing. It's that education piece. It's so easy to say no, but without thinking about the flow-on effects of what that means for the community, as you said, Rob.
Yeah, so let's break down those three elements: inform, influence, and inspire. And what are some of the, like, if we're trying to inform the community, what are some of the ways that we can actually engage with the community to let them know, hey, this is what we're thinking and why we're thinking it? What's the common misconceptions there, and what's the best practice ways to actually do that?
One of the things we like talking about is actually selling or talking about what are the benefits of the development. So often when we make development applications to the city, the reporting, and it's very legislative, and I'm sure we all know, but the reporting becomes very defensive. It's about why it might not fit this criteria, but it's it's okay for this reason. And we want to really flip that conversation around and say why this development will be great for the particular location. And I guess that's one place to start. But also what we find is that there's so many voices that are in the no camp, and if there's ever a controversy, if it's the radio or the news or blogs, there's always someone that's happy to stand there, cross their arms, and say why they don't want why they don't want the project, why they are worried about the traffic or what it's going to look like or the character of their neighbourhood. So that informed space is just always to be available to have that conversation, and whether it is in the media or whether it's just your backyard barbecue conversation, it's about standing up for why we need development and why development is good. I guess that there's some of the spaces that we say, we really want people to hopefully get on board with. But then, we've got a website that's got a lot of resources that are trying to help people to understand some of the benefits of good development outcomes.
Yeah, well, I would qualify that to say the right development in the right location at the right time, which, if the wrong development goes in, then understandably people want to be upset and should be upset. But in most instances, developers put a lot of time and effort and research into actually understanding what the needs of the community are in order to put that solution in front of them. So, you don't spend, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in doing a development with nobody wanting to take it up. It's usually somebody there that wants it. And so it's really about informing the others who don't want it what the benefits are to the people that do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. When a developer puts in those applications, there's so many consultants that have to have input and into the impacts that it will have, whether it's acoustic, with noise, or traffic, with engineering consultants. There's so much that's considered, and all of that informs that development and how the form that it ends up taking. There's that rigor behind it.
And what I've seen, I guess, across the board in every state and most councils, I won't say every single council, but they are elected officials. And so when the community starts to jump up and down and make noise, then the elected officials tend to, err on the side of, hey, I want to get my voting ratepayers to re-vote me back in. And so quite often, I guess the noise can actually have a negative impact with the political persuasion side of things to say, well, now that the politicians themselves don't want to be on board. So it's a multifaceted problem here, where it's not just informing what the I guess the community needs, but it's also informing the politicians to make sure that they are very aware of what is actually needed and get them as advocates for us to say why that's a good thing for our community.
That's it. It's, really when we talk about in our Yimby group that this is really a conversation that we're having with developers to make sure that we are doing the right developments in the right locations and doing them well. It's also a conversation with the government when there is policy change or opportunities for policy change. And it's also a conversation with the community to hopefully help the community understand what is good development so that they can be asking the politicians for that. So, absolutely, the politicians are going to follow the loudest voice and that community sentiment about development. It's quite fascinating how the conversation is so similar across the world with a lot of the US groups and the UK groups. They're all saying, the biggest issue with the community is neighbourhood character and it's traffic. It's all the same issues in every growing city. And, it's about trying to make sure that conversation is broadened out. As Mel said at the beginning about housing affordability, it's about environmental outcomes. And I think the opportunity is now when, it's a topic in our federal election, housing affordability. Yes, they're talking about financial incentives and actions, but really it's a conversation about housing, and we're now having it on the national stage. That's what was happening in San Francisco about 8 years ago.
And hence where this starts to become really challenging, because when we start to talk housing affordability, the kinds of policies that create, I guess, that sort of housing then start to create, I guess, a perception that we're going to have low socioeconomic people living in our community, in and around, I guess, people who think that they're a little bit more affluent. And so those things don't really align with each other. So it's, yes, we want to make housing more affordable, but how do we do that in ways that are creative, in ways that have good built form, good usability, and keep the community engaged to say this is actually needed in your area, because not everyone can afford the house that you're in. The big McMansion of the past is no longer the great Australian dream because people just can't afford it anymore.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. Affordability means so many things to so many people, and it's such a broad topic. But at the end of the day, if we can get more housing, it's supply and demand, but also more forms of housing so that you can have small houses, tiny houses, McMansions, and everything in between. That's how we get greater opportunities for affordability within a society that's still prosperous and doing well.
Yeah, without urban sprawl, which, as you said, adds all sorts of other challenges with regards to commuting and transport and all those sorts of things. Bad traffic, pollution, all sorts of things that come as a byproduct. As you said, it's what are you saying yes to when you're saying no to this? So why Yimby? There are, I guess, lots of different industry associations that already exist out there. So, we've got the UDIA, we've got the Housing Industry Association, we've got the Master Builders, we've got, the Property Council and Urban Land Institute and a whole bunch more. Why add one more? Why Yimby? What's the point of difference between yourselves and the others?
For me personally, it was that we weren't having this conversation. So while, of course, there's so many groups and they're all representing their own piece in the puzzle, what was missing was a conversation about, I guess, some of that missing middle housing that we all talk about. So things between a house or, master planned housing estate or a high rise that's 20 stories or 40 stories or whatever in the city, all that stuff in the middle, which is happening in our suburbs, which is happening all around us, which is part of the way that we live. That's the stuff that's disappearing or becoming much more challenging. It's duplexes, it's triplexes, it's quadplexes, it's small walk-ups, it's, probably up to that 5-level apartment. And that's what's getting really difficult, but often those bigger groups aren't really advocating for that space, and the conversation that they're having is really with government. We need to be having this conversation with the community to get them inspired to say, we want this form of housing, we need this form of housing, and it's good for our diversity, it's good for the environment, it's good for affordability. It's not just all about, jobs and growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, Rob. I was just going to say, one of my favorites, Natalie, when you're listing off that list of different housing types, is the Fonzie flat.
Yes.
The studio over the garage. It's just, it's a fun one. You know what I'm talking about, Rob? Do you know?
Absolutely. I'm old enough to know who the Fonz is. Absolutely.
Just wondering if Happy Days fan or not.
I find that there's in so many councils, there's just a complete no, we shall not have that kind of, and there's lots of different housing types, but they'll be very, no, I'm not going to have duplexes, or no, I'm not going to have Fonzie flats. And they have a very black and white outcome, as opposed to actually looking at their community and go, do you know what? We don't want it everywhere, but in this location, maybe it's not such a bad thing. And I don't think that level of thinking has actually gone in all councils. They certainly have in some, but I guess there's a multitude of different ethnicities, family sizes, age groups, I guess living requirements. Not everybody needs to have a giant house. A lot of people want low maintenance. A lot of people need low maintenance. A lot of people don't want the big backyard. So having opportunity for everyone, it's all well and good to say, the Great Australian Dream, but I think the Great Australian Dream has changed.
That's the thing. It's different for so many, different people. We've changed as a society over the last 20, 40, 60 years, however long we want to look at it. And that's unfortunately no longer reflected in our housing policy. So I guess if we say, there are suburbs, the older suburbs probably in each of the main cities have developed without planners and without city plans. And sometimes those older suburbs are the ones that are so interesting because they do have that diversity of housing types and sizes and shapes and all the lifestyle elements that go in between. But it's probably those newer suburbs that we started to build in the 80s and the 90s that have become very homogenous, and that's where probably, I'm from Brisbane, so when I look at Brisbane City Council, and it's a massive area, 60% of our housing is housing areas is low density housing, and now that means a house. It doesn't even mean rent out your granny flat. You could build a granny flat and literally put granny in, but as soon as you rent it out or have another household in there, that's illegal. You can't have a duplex, you can't have a triplex, you can't have a townhouse anymore after that was banned a couple of years ago. So we've been weeding out, we've been losing all of those opportunities for diversity that were there in the suburbs that we all love. And apparently we're doing it to protect our neighbourhood character. But actually, if you ask people what are those character suburbs they love, they're probably those ones that have all that diversity in them.
So what are the politicians missing, right? So what's the message that if we were to have a conversation with every leader of every council all at the same time, what are the key elements that they're actually missing from how do they think differently?
I do think that we've got to get the community asking for different things, or at least not thinking that they're being the savior of the neighborhood by stopping development. That's that attitude that we have to change. And I think that that's been very strong, and it's been very strong since the 80s. And people have felt like, they are doing a community service by saying no to a development. And now that affordability and environmental sustainability, climate, these are all topics that so many people are talking about. We need to connect those dots and help people realize that they need to be asking for something different. And I think it's only then that we'll have the politicians change their thinking.
Yeah, so
I totally agree. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I cut you off there, Melissa. Sorry.
That's okay. No, I was just concurring with what Natalie said. If we're to have a chat with the councils they really are up against what they're there to represent the community. And so that's the piece that Yimby can play is, as people understand the benefits of good development, when the council come up to the community, there's more of an alignment there, rather than community having to, I guess, sway to the few no's, the few loud no's that come up through the community.
And so we have to make it easier for people to do that. And I think that's been the challenge, because as we all know, we're all time poor, we're all busy. And it's usually only if we're really opposed to something that we're going to take the time to write that objection, or, to talk to our neighbours and rally and get together. And so it's very challenging to get that alternate view. And it's only when people start to feel some pain or some desire to change that, like Sonia Charles did when she couldn't afford to live in the city that she was working in San Francisco. It's only when you can get that real passion behind people to go and do it of their own accord. But if we can make it easier for people and show them that there is a group that will help them write a submission, or show them how to, then we can start to do that for developments, we can start to do that for major city shaping projects, or we can start to do it for housing policy. And so the beauty is that technology's moved on, so people literally don't have to get out their letter and write a letter to the Lord Mayor and post it in anymore. And so, on our Facebook or our LinkedIn social media pages, we can alert people to developments and say, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3, click here, copy this or make up your own and press submit. And all of a sudden you've made a positive submission saying, we want this housing project in our city. And it's only then that the politicians will start to see, there's 10 or 100 or 1,000 people objecting, but there's also 10 or 100 or 1,000 people saying yes. So, in Queensland, we've picked a couple of city shaping projects and we've gone and written positive submissions. We were going to get the world's greenest apartment. There was going to be a zip line down Mount Cootha. And so we actually got people to write submissions. And if you can make it easy for people, we were getting 700 submissions going in to say yes.
So in my, I guess, very simplistic thinking, there's probably 5 or 6 elements that I'm thinking that should be part of almost every application from a consistency of lodgement. So we want to be talking about how it adds to the diversity of the area, how it adds to the affordability of the area, the lifestyle and the amenity that actually creates, how it actually contributes to sustainability in the environment and that sort of thing. I guess how it actually blends in with the housing policy that actually that sits in there, and probably the social value that it's actually providing by adding something, I guess, to the community and providing connectedness to everything else that sits all around it. Is there anything that I've kind of missed there? Am I being overly simplistic, or?
That's a good list. I think sometimes, yes, there'll always be something specific about the project, but they're probably those big categories to fall into. And we always say, like, it's about adding something personal. So, if it was a little missing middle project in a suburb that doesn't have a lot of that, we'd say, put something in like, we want our children to be able to afford to live in the suburb that they've grown up in, or we want something to be able to move into when we get older, and add that personal, I guess, getting away from just having people say their own, what they want is everything that looks just like them, and to what their children might need, or what they might need as they get older, or hopefully move on, and what the broader community might need, what their neighbours might need, or how do we get more neighbours.
So if we were to, I guess, come up with, the perfect scenario, what would represent good development? So when we're trying to, I guess, put our message out to the community, how do we articulate, hey, this is a good development? What are the things that we need to highlight?
I think that some of those things. I mean, Mel might get into that in a bit more detail, but I think it is about showing that it's going to provide alternative housing choices in their neighbourhood, or it's about saying it fits into the character, but it might not fit into exactly what the planning scheme says here because the character is different, or it might be, saying that it's going to help to get more people into a neighbourhood to support the local shops. and cafes, which have probably been particularly affected during COVID and post-COVID. So it's much more front of mind for the council to be reading about. And then all of those environmental, there's usually something in the project that either is just, this is infill development, so it doesn't need a whole lot of new infrastructure that's going to come and unlock this development opportunity. It's going to be able to already be on a bus line or a train line. So it's usually specific to the project, but it's ticking off, I guess, at the end of the day, the economic, so that affordability angle, the social angle, that it might provide people with a choice that's different to what otherwise would lock them out, and those environmental aspects, that can be from energy transition to green walls and everything in between.
Yeah, I think the consolidation of the urban form is so important to our environmental impact, because we need more housing. It has to go somewhere. So we can either be really clever about how we do that and utilize the existing services in our urban areas and help to provide greater density and population where it's appropriate, so that, as you said, cafes, restaurants and shops can operate and function and can flourish. But also we're also in the meantime limiting the environmental impact of not having to rezone either farmland or good agricultural land, or even just bushland, which we need to sustain us as a species. So it just makes sense on all of those levels.
So and all valid points. I guess there are obviously, with people, I guess, making complaints, there are sometimes where there's genuine justification, and rightly so. So what are the common challenges that you see where, they're complaining about genuine things that they do actually care about? So I'm thinking things like car parking and density and that sort of thing. But what are some of the other challenges that they have valid points on that we can start to think about and address?
Typically, it's the immediate neighbours that will have the primary issues to raise, and that might be privacy and amenity related. So maybe it's the positioning of windows and openings, it's setbacks and how far away we are from each other and how we deal with that interface. So I guess those interface issues are things that if we're doing development well, we'll look at that context when we're looking at a new site and understand what's around us, and make sure that we are designing within, with intent to deal with that interface well. And then as you, I guess, get beyond just the immediate neighbours and that immediate interface, it becomes the streetscape. So that's when that character comes in. It's the traffic issues, and then I guess more broadly it becomes, is that the type of housing that's fitting into a neighbourhood? So it might be looking at the form of it rather than the land use of it. It might be looking at the materials that are used. There's so many different aspects to look at. But and I guess depending on the scale and the type of project and the location, there's going to be so many different answers to that. But I think ultimately it's about making sure that we've been conscious about fitting it in within a context, and really, if it's a project that has a change that is going to be made within a neighbourhood, having that conversation, doing some community engagement.
Yeah, so neighbourhood character is an interesting concept, and by pure coincidence, we had a presentation at one of our meetups in Melbourne yesterday, all on neighbourhood character in I guess Melbourne context, because character is one of those things that gets created at a point in time, and then there's a fixation to never move away from that character, which is interesting because at that time, when it was actually created, might have been 50 years ago, might have been 100 years ago, but at that point in time, that was cutting edge. So why can't cutting edge still be cutting edge in today's day? That's probably a question that I'd kind of throw out to our politicians to say, character is an evolving thing. It shouldn't be a momentary point in time that locks us into a point in history. We don't want to forget our history, but at the same time, we want to be sympathetic to it, but at the same time, I think we always want to be evolving.
Yeah, it's a fine balance, and I definitely take on board what you say. And yeah, the contrast it can be interesting, but if we don't allow that contrast to happen, well, if you don't allow the new development, there will be no contrast. Yeah.
Yeah. So where are some examples, and this might be a little bit politically sensitive, but where are some examples of policy that has gone horribly wrong, where they've just missed the point of, I guess, what would be good community outcomes?
I think both Natalie and I have experienced this of like recently over the past few years, a similar story between New South Wales and Queensland. Natalie, do you want to tell about the missing middle story, and I can then talk about what's happened here in New South Wales?
Sure. So wind the clock back three or 4 years, and in Brisbane, so again a very large council area for Queensland, did a round of community engagement about what was what people wanted in their city, and unfortunately out of that came a ban on all forms of missing middle housing in our low density suburbs, which was 2/3 of Brisbane, and also they said they didn't want the congestion in the streets, in street parking, so more car parks. So what happened, unfortunately, is in Brisbane, the proposal was to ban townhouses, which was really those sort of row houses, anything from a triplex, a terrace house, up to a big group of them on a large block of land. But banning that as the last form of missing middle housing that you could still do in Brisbane's low density suburbs, and at the same time for all apartments in all of Brisbane, increasing the car parking requirements. And this was, I guess, unfortunately, just at a time where we're joining this Yimby network overseas, seeing that other I guess, states and cities over in the US were being sued by Yimby groups over there. So I know that seems a very American term, but they were actually holding their councils to account for not delivering enough housing. And as a result, the councils were starting to actually increase the opportunities. So they were basically putting headlines out there and racing to become the first states in the US to ban areas of only single family dwellings. So saying, sure, you can build single family dwellings, but we can't have housing policy that prevents anything else. And here we are in Brisbane banning everything other than single family dwellings. They were also, there's plenty of examples over in the US that have just taken out car parking requirements. So just leave it up to the market as to how many car parks you put, but no longer have those minimum car parking requirements. And yet here we are pushing it up just when we're talking about, trying to get people walking and biking and, looking at the way they travel around cities. And all of a sudden it was really, I guess, designed to make apartments, unable. It really just reduced the yield. You couldn't quite fit the number of apartments onto a block that you used to be able to fit on because you had to build so many more car parking spaces.
Well, that one in particular, I can both commend and condemn Brisbane City Council in some aspects. They did a lot of community engagement to go out and actually, I guess, canvass the community to say, what is it that you actually want? But I think they asked the wrong question. So they put a lot of effort in, but asked the wrong question. It was more, what do you not like about development was the question, as opposed to, hey, what do you need when you're going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? Because right now where you are living is great, but in 20 years' time, that probably won't be the housing requirement that you have. And so I think that was a missed opportunity, and it created such a groundswell of negativity that came back from the community that they then felt that it was a mandate that it must be banned. And it really came back to the wrong question was asked.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Yeah.
So how did that also translate in New South Wales? Similar outcomes there?
Yeah, look, it was sort of the timing was around the same, but the state government identified that housing was becoming a crisis issue across the state. in terms of affordability and just supply and diversity. And so at that state level, they made a decision to bring in a new code which allowed, I guess, the missing middle type of housing, so duplexes and townhouses, and also a new development form they introduced, which was called the manor house, which was 4 apartments at a maximum of 100 square meters. So that was quite interesting. So they brought that in, and the code enabled those development forms to be fast tracked, so you could get your approval within 20 days rather than going through council. However, the way that they wrote the policy, without getting too technical here, but it actually reverted back to all of the local council controls and planning schemes. So, for example, if that type of housing wasn't permissible in a certain zoning as set by the local controls, you couldn't then go and use the state planning, the state code. And what happened was the state, when they were introducing this, allowed councils to defer the introduction of it, so before it became legislated. And that actually gave councils enough time to change their planning schemes, to take out dual occupancies, to take out townhouses from so many different zones. So by the time the state government actually came into force, it really had very little impact, because none of that housing was permissible anywhere anymore. It was such a shame to see that, because we were all championing it and you know, as a way to help solve our housing crisis, and that was the outcome.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is what in New South Wales is called CDC, or Complying Development Code, and you're right. It's a fantastic outcome that allows for consistency across all councils. And one of the challenges in I guess Sydney in particular is, I think there's 37 different councils across the Greater Sydney region, and so you know that's 37 different sets of rules to comply with. So the state government coming up with this CDC was a fantastic initiative, but that loophole was the killer, where councils were able to effectively opt out.
Yeah.
Now, I've had a small technology challenge with one of my monitors disappearing, and all my cheat sheets and notes are actually sitting on there. So that said, see if we can just wing it from here. But what I guess when we're starting to put our applications in, we want to be putting this in a way that's going to be presenting our case well. With what they call performance-based planning systems is really what everything has now. So performance-based, so they've set a rules, and how well do you actually comply? I think that performance-based planning scheme across the board is not very well understood, and the best way to actually conform to that. Any insights in what we can do for that?
I guess for me, I like the system that's performance-based, and I agree it's absolutely created this issue within the community that it's all a big dark art. Planning's a dark art. There's no, we don't understand why a neighbourhood plan or a city plan or a rule can say, I don't know, 3 stories, and all of a sudden we see something that's 4, or that's where that inform part of the Yimby mission sits. But it's hard to get people interested in talking planning speak and performance-based planning. So I guess all we say is, be careful what you wish for, because if we take performance-based, which is a bit of flexibility to fit into the context and meet an objective rather than a prescriptive criteria like a specific height or a specific setback, I think the benefit of having that flexibility is what creates the amazing precincts and developments and buildings that we end up loving and using. And so, we just say we've got to really call them out and say, I can rattle off a few in Brisbane, but I know we're all in different places as we come together today. So you will perhaps know them or need to dig them out and find them out. But there's so many things that, are innovative or, cutting edge, or just no longer the planning schemes become a bit redundant in a area. It's so, didn't even anticipate the types of development that we might have now. One of the ones that we've got lately is doggy daycare. People want to be able to drop their dog off to work, drop off their dog on the way to work, yet all of our planning schemes still call that animal keeping or kennels, and they're expected to be out in rural areas. So we've got to acknowledge that we can't have a perfect planning system, and we've got to acknowledge that the innovative precincts and developments are those ones that do sit out of the box. So I guess we just say be careful what you wish for if the community is calling for something more prescriptive.
Yeah. So I guess all of these issues and challenges with people, I guess, in that Nimby camp making complaints have a massive impact to us as developers, because I know that we put, I guess, hundreds of thousands of dollars into buying the property, and then tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands into the development application itself. And yet it only takes one or two objections that can actually kill a development. What can we do to try and minimize the number of those objections that come through? What can we do proactively as developers to get our community engaged?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I always recommend to developers that I work with. And, as you said, one or two objections can have a really negative impact. But one way to alleviate that is actually to go and talk to the neighbours who are generally going to be the main objectors before you lodge a DA. Because receiving the notification from council, which council is required to do for any DAs, to notify the neighbours nearby that this is going ahead, it can kind of come as a bit of a shock if they are not expecting it. And sometimes just having that conversation over a cup of tea can just really take the heat out of it. So that's one thing that I always recommend doing, and just having a chat about it, printing out the plans and just talking them through.
Helping people to even just read the plans. Like, I've had so many examples where you might be looking at the block, but the block slopes. And so when they're looking at an elevation, it looks like it's 4 stories, but it's actually only 3, because it's, it's very hard sometimes for people to even read a plan. So having that conversation is definitely helpful. I just say it's about also highlighting what those benefits are going to be for the community, and also trying to see if there are people in your neighbourhood that might support the development and get them to write in positive submissions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do people actually start to become involved in, I guess, the Yimby movement? So there's 2 of you here from New South Wales and Queensland, but we've also got other members across the country. So how do people actually get involved? What's the call to action that we want everyone to start to harness here?
Yeah, so it's very social media driven. So we've both got our Facebook pages up there, and we've also got a website, which is, for us, yimbyqueensland.com.au, and it's really about engaging in the conversation. So on social media, highlighting if there is a great project in the area and that you want people to understand what's good about it and maybe make positive submissions, let us know about them on Facebook or on our website. And equally, if we know about projects, we can let other people know. But I think it's not just that. It's not that it all has to be something that is happening through not-for-profit groups like Yimby groups, but it can just be your own backyard barbecue conversation. I mean, I was at a housewarming for the people across the road, and people started talking about a new development down the road on the railway station that's going to bring great little coffee shops and cafes and a small little supermarket to our area. And I think it's great. So, having that conversation, because, the first part of the conversation was with, it's going to be so tall, and it's, it's not something that we want. So engaging in your own community or engaging through our social media is what I would say. And if there's something that we need to all be saying to politicians, then let's just be all part of the conversation so that we can get that messaging right.
Very good. Well, what I'm going to do now, folks, is I'm going to see if I can jump over and see if we've got any questions that have actually come from our guys. Now, just a little bit of button pushing to make that happen from my side.
While
so
you're
give
doing
me-
that, I might just clarify. I saw in the chat somebody kindly put in the step that we were referring to before. So yeah, it's actually the low-rise diversity code, and it sits underneath the exempt and compliant development step. So it uses that pathway, but it's got its own set of codes and controls that need to be met.
Understood. Okay, so looking at the feed, I can't see any questions that have actually come through. So we may have gotten away with a clean slate here. We've either completely bamboozled everyone, or we've dumbfounded them and they don't know what to do. So, with that said, folks, I'm going to say thank you very much to both Melissa and Natalie for their time. And can't wait to catch up. So thank you again for your time, and can't wait to catch up on the next Sunday session. So next Sunday at 5 o'clock. So till then, folks, bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.